Coming up on this week's Citizens Report, headline hysteria softening suckers for war. And yes, the government should do banking. Welcome to the show. It's the 9th of March 2023. I'm Glen Isherwood and I'm joined today by Citizens Party researcher and writer Richard Bardon. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Glen.
Today's program, we are going to cover some pretty serious stuff and quite heavy in terms of confronting material. But before we get into that, if you're new to the program, please like, share and subscribe to the channel. Hit that bell icon so you get notified of new shows. For those who like the ideas presented on this show, donate. We ask everyone to support the campaigns. Go onto our website, look for the donate button at the top to support our efforts. And finally, if you want more details on the show's topics today, go online and hover around the website for a little. You'll get an offer for a free copy of this. The Australian Alert Service, the flagship magazine of the Australian Citizens Party. This is where you get all the details. Everything we cover on the show is in more depth there. But Richard, on this program we usually start our theme on banking. The first headline or the subject is banking. However, we're going to have to flip it today because the media has gone so feral and the hysterical this week, gunning for war. On the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, we had headlines such as Red Alert, War Risk Exposed, and Australia Must Prepare for Threat of China War. We want to get into what's behind this, but it's one of those things that is coming at the 20th anniversary of the war in Iraq, coming up very soon. And back then in 2003, the Citizens Party, then CEC, fought heavily to expose the lies and the agenda behind getting that war started. We documented the forces around the neoconservatives in the United States, people like Wolfowitz, Donald Rumsfeld, Richard Pearl, John Bolton, Dick Cheney and George Bush. A war that was created on lying pretexts and in a context where it was stated with the Wolfowitz Doctrine that the US wanted to create a unipolar world where they would not tolerate the rise of any future superpower. They reserve the right to decide which nations would be allowed to function, and their regime change would get rid of anyone that they didn't like. So there's a lot of lessons there, over 1 million dead Iraqis later. And it's also, I wanted to start today by playing a few clips from a recent event in Melbourne here just this week. The artist David Dormino has come to town, and he set up in South Bank the statues for bronze statues he made of Ed Snowden, Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning. And at this event there were many speakers. Robert Barwick, our research director, got to speak, but also David McBride and Dean Yates. These clips offer a very, very sobering reflection on the Iraq War and still today the injustice that's come from that with Julian Assange. So let's play those clips now. The first one being from David McBride on the case of Julian Assange, and then the second clip from Dean Yates on what was Julian Assange's crime that we're still waiting to get true justice for.
To those conservatives out there who say, oh, somehow Assange endangered men and women in uniform, I say this to you. You are a fool. You're an absolute fool, because so many good people in uniform were killed by George Bush, John Howard, and Tony Blair, and that idiot Cheney. They killed good soldiers. They killed 1 million people with brown skin, who, and I hate to say it, they matter just as much. We need to put Tony Blair on trial. John Howard is not a hero. He's remembered well, but if you look back on his legacy, I'm afraid to say he's a villain. He killed a lot of people, he lied, and he sold this country. He started the sale, which we're still paying off, of Australia to America. And there is no Australia in foreign policy anymore.
I was the Reuters bureau chief in Iraq when an Apache gunship with the call sign Crazy Horse 18 killed 12 men in Baghdad on July 12, 2007. Two of those men were Reuters photographer Namir Noor Eldeen and Reuters driver Sayed Chum. My staff killed on my watch. Nearly 3 years later, on April 5, 2010, Julian Assange published video of that attack. The classified footage had been sent to WikiLeaks by US military whistleblower Chelsea Manning. Julian called the video collateral murder. It shocked millions of people around the world. Collateral murder connects me to Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning by an invisible thread. Namir and Said would have been forgotten statistics of that Iraq war if not for them. That tape, the most controversial in the history of war, will keep the names of my dead colleagues alive forever. But rather than celebrated for his journalistic and publishing achievements, Julian is a much maligned figure.
So Richard, what you see there is a clear example of where true justice would be going after the real liars and the real war criminals. To this day, they are pursuing the whistleblower. That's the first time I realised that Dean Yates was an Australian that was the head of Reuters. And he, he is one of these people who's coming out saying, where's our government on this?
Yeah, no, because now and then, the last 40, more than 40, probably 50 years, they just by and large, just toe the line. If the Americans say we're going to, it used to be the British, and then it was the Americans. They say they're going to war, therefore we're at war. And we're the only ally that does that at just every opportunity, just rushes into it. Even the British and the Canadians have they sat out Vietnam. We didn't, straight in.
Well, there is a theme of this show that we'll come back to on that around the question of colonisation. But I also want to plug right now for those in the Melbourne and surrounding region that on the 18th of March coming up, which is a Saturday, there will be a 20th anniversary of the Iraq War protest taking place, a rally, a call for peace, truth not war, and two guests that we've had on our program, The Citizens Insight, will be speakers at that rally. The former ambassador and diplomat John Lander, and also the war crimes whistleblower David McBride, who you just saw. If you're in the Melbourne area, get along to that rally. It's 1 p.m. on Saturday the 18th, not too far away, at the State Library. So this frightening dynamic, Richard, we're seeing forces right now, as exemplified by these headlines in the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, are gunning for war with China, our biggest trading partner. There's two issues on this I want to cover today. First of all, who's behind these maniacal headlines? And secondly, you've written an article in this week's Australian Alert Service documenting a case of an Australian citizen who, his name is Daniel Duggan, who is suffering the same kind of treatment, vindictive and brutal treatment of the Australian authorities that Julian Assange is currently suffering in Britain. Two Australian citizens, one on our own soil, that is currently the subject of an attempt by the United States to extradite. We'll get into that case in a second. But tell us, first of all, who are the forces behind these headlines in the papers this week?
Right, so the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age, the Nine Network, former Fairfax papers, they're presenting this like, these guys, as though they had some evidence that China's about to attack us. They're seriously talking about, Chinese invasions of this, that, and the other, and pretending like, that you can see the graphic there. Excuse me. The fighter jets coming from the big sinister red China, right, on the map. But what they've created this story. They've made this up. They've pulled together this team of so-called experts to sound this alarm about China, but it's all the same idiots who have been completely wrong about everything for, in some cases, over 20 years. And we can go through some of the characters involved, but this is the media making that, as Caitlin Johnson, the Melbourne independent writer, who we've run one of her articles in this week's alert service, but she says that they are manufacturing the consent for a war with China, just like they did with Iraq 20 years ago. 20 years ago this month.
Yeah.
And so who have we got? We've got, one of the experts is a retired general called Mick Ryan, who, regular contributor to various of these warmongering, think tanks and publications that they put out, and someone who's frequently comes out with complete nonsense on Twitter and gets challenged by other former military guys who actually know what they're talking about. How he ever got promoted to a general is beyond me, but then I'm told that they're mostly political appointments. But the main one...
Can we just step back a second? So Mick Ryan is one of these panellists of five
that have
been
experts
assembled for this, that have become the case for this article. But let's just take a minute to talk about Peter Harcher.
Oh, yeah, well...
The journalist who is...
the guy who's convened all of this and is the lead writer.
Because without Peter Harcher, this whole story wouldn't be run. Who is Peter Harcher?
He's a political and international editor for the SMH, and probably just about the biggest anti-China warmonger in the Australian media today as an individual, and closely tied in, surprise, with this thing called the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue, where you want to talk about foreign interference. This thing, they bring over Australian up and coming politicians, journalists, public figures, and wine and dine them and offer them all these inside information and indoctrination program basically. And the guy who founded that, fellow called Phil Scanlon, he has a connection to Channel 9 that owns the Fairfax papers, because he was closely associated with, he worked for Peter Costello's father-in-law. And then, of course, Peter Costello, works, he's the chairman of Channel 9 now. He's got almost a lifelong association with this guy. And so, and Harcher is he's the point man for all of this lunatic China bashing in the 9 papers.
Well, what you said about the manufacturing consent, again, back on the Iraq War, without the role of Murdoch and his media empire in the United States and Australia, there wouldn't have been the softening of the population with the constant barrage of lies about weapons of mass destruction, which has all been proven and shown. But he ran the operation to convince so many Americans that this was for freedom and democracy and for liberating Iraq and so on.
Yeah.
So this is a bit a repeat playbook. So Peter Harcher very connected into the top levels of this warmongering crowd in the Murdoch Fairfax media. It's interesting you mentioned the Australian Leadership Dialogue, because as one reaction to these stories that are run in the SMH and the Age was the reaction from Paul Keating, former Prime Minister, who's also criticised the Australian-American leadership dialogue as when Australians go over to America, they drink the Kool-Aid and they come back almost brainwashed into all things American and lose all sense of independent thought.
Yeah, he's lately taken to calling them the Austral-Americans.
Right.
But yeah, he said a few years ago, it's like the alliance with the Americans has become this sort of he said that it's treated as a sacrament. You know, it's become an end in itself that is, you know, any means are justified as long as it maintains the alliance. So what do we need it for?
Well, it strikes me as interesting that a number of former prime ministers have criticised how blindly we followed the United States. Most notably was the late Malcolm Fraser with his book Dangerous Allies. You've got Paul Keating. You have had Kevin Rudd to an extent say that, you know, we can't sleepwalk into a war with China. We need to make a better effort on diplomacy. There's a recognition of former prime ministers speaking out. We put down the challenge to Albanese. Why are you waiting to be a former prime minister to go back to, you know, actually growing a pair and taking on this ideology? Yeah.
If you're watching this, Mr. Albanese, not that that's going to happen, but you know, don't be a former prime minister regretting what you've done, presuming we live that long. You know, because if they get a nuclear war started, well, that's it. But anything short of that, you know.
Well, it's very alarming what you'll cover in a second on our second part of this with the case of Daniel Duggan, because it's exemplary of everything wrong that Mark Dreyfus and Albanese is doing at the moment. But just on Paul Keating's quote. He was quoted in comment on these articles by Peter Harcher. He said, I believe that this is unparalleled in modern Australian journalism. And he goes on to say that the illegitimacy of the publication is manifest even to a moderately informed reader. The management and board of Nine Group will have much to answer for should it allow further publication of this wantonly biased inflammatory material. And he, you know, criticised this panel as having no actual substantial amount of real in-depth knowledge of China.
No knowledge of China, especially its policies on things relating to war. You know, what it will and won't go to war over, and that's. You know, the other thing about this expert panel is the main guy on it, the guy who's quoted the most, is Peter Jennings, the head of ASPI for 10 years, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, that is paid, literally takes commissions from its core funding comes from the Australian Defence Department, Australian, you know, your and my and all our viewers' taxpayer money. But other than that, it takes commissions from Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Thales, you know, Boeing, and the US, British, Japanese, Dutch, and other Western aligned, you know, US aligned NATO governments to write warmongering trash about China. This is the guy who kept insisting that China hacked the census for weeks in 2016. For a couple of, you know, went on with it for a couple of weeks after the Bureau of Statistics had said, actually, no, it was just a mechanical fault and nobody hacked us at all. You know,
and the intelligence agency
ran an investigation. There's nothing there.
To it.
There's nothing there. There was, but to this day, you still see in newspapers, and something a Chinese cyber attack on the census that never happened. That's who this guy is. He's saying now we'll be at war in 3 years. Well, 3-4 years ago, he said we'd be at war in 3 months.
Right. So 3 months, 3 years, whatever.
You know, these are not people to be taken seriously.
So we mentioned before Mick Ryan. He's a member of this, a professor of the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. Again, like ASPI, they have international funding coming from Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, the US government.
Yeah, so it's a Washington think tank, but it's...
I note on ASPI that a former Australian diplomat, Bruce Hay, called it the propaganda arm of the CIA and the US government in Australia. foreign interference, anybody. Just naming the other three that were on this this 5 panel, Lavina Lee, who is also from the Centre for Strategic and International Studies and from ASPI.
Yeah, regular contributor.
Alan Finkel, a scientist for the Australian government, and Leslie Seebeck, who is from a less-known organisation, the National Institute of Strategic Resilience, which we know little of. So these 5 are presenting war with China in 3 years. Now, I'll quote one part of this this report, Richard, and if you care to comment, because I've never seen it so blatant. But in the report itself, in The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, they are quoted as saying, most important of all is creating a psychological shift. Urgency must replace complacency. The recent decades of tranquility were not the norm in human affairs, but an aberration. Australia's holiday from history is over.
Engineering a psychological shift. In other words, war propaganda.
So they're admitting it blatantly in their article. We are doing this to convince you and to use psychological warfare on you. On behalf of whom? Well, we know it. It's so blatant that even on the Today program, 2GB talkback host, where's his name?
Chris O'Keefe.
Chris O'Keefe has had this to say on TV this week as well.
It's alarming though, Chris, isn't it?
No, but it's hysterical, the reporting. Now, I know that Nine owns the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, so they're our colleagues. But the reporting this morning is hysterical. Now, if you've got the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, who are the ones saying, oh, well, we could be going to war in 3 years. Well, they're funded by the Australian Defence Force, Lockheed Martin, Thales and Boeing. Defence material companies that need money to provide defence hardware to Australia. So where's the bread buttered here? And I just think that it does Australia no good having discussions about going to war in 3 years. It's hysterical. It is over the top. And the CIA, the chief of the CIA said, well, President Xi actually has said, well, get your army prepared to invade Taiwan by 2027. However, they're thinking to themselves, well, maybe we can't do it. In that same article, it says that President Xi is now considering whether or not it's an achievable outcome, invading Taiwan. None of that's in the newspaper. But we're talking about going to war in 3 years. How is that good when someone wakes up in the morning and says, oh, no? Everybody knows China's a threat, a strategic threat, but going to war in 3 years? Talk about scaring the pants off people for no reason.
I mean, it does seem a bit unrealistic. I guess the main point of it is that we aren't prepared. We don't have...
prepared for what?
Well, we don't have any of the defence mechanisms
for what?
necessary.
Is this going to be Kokoda Mark II? Is that what we're talking about? No one can explain to me what we're supposed to be prepared for. I mean, I guess... how big Australia is? You know how hard it'd be to attack?
There's a lot of people in China.
What are we supposed to do? The Armada's going to show up in Darwin. Please, come on. Can we just settle down a bit and have an adult conversation about this?
Okay, listen, just Field Marshal Chris and Admiral Sarah. I think there was something Chris said. Look, I'm not going to wake up this morning and start saying Australians should be, gigantically alarmed. It's not. We've got to work with China. But we've always have to maintain our own national security and our own defence interests. I tell you what I think people want to hear this morning. Is the government doing everything we can in defence and national security? Yes. Are we also trying to maintain constructive bilateral relations with China? Yes. We'll engage where we can, but we'll disagree where we must. I don't think the speculation about all the other stuff's really going to take us too far, is it?
Do you think it's hysterical, Bill?
Oh, listen, I certainly don't think it's helpful to speculate about, the dramatic headlines in the paper. I don't see where that gets us, frankly.
Well said.
Well said. Oh, wow. Agreement. I like it. Let's have more of it. All right, Bill, Chris, thanks so much for your time today.
So Channel 9 can see blatantly that this is hysterics.
Channel 9, whose company publishes those newspapers, as he acknowledges in that clip. But, come on.
Yep. So that, Richard, if you're buying into this stuff, viewers, I have to say, please reflect. The military-industrial complex wants you to be afraid of China, thinking of an invasion next Tuesday. who's funding this psychological warfare? They admit it, and if you follow the chain, it goes back to the US military-industrial complex. For the benefit of newer viewers, Richard, what is the military-industrial complex?
So this is what the World War II general and then American President Dwight Eisenhower warned about in his farewell speech way back in the 50s. He said, you know, we must be on guard against the acquisition of unwarranted power by a military-industrial complex, you know, all the war industries that weren't turned back to peaceful purposes. Instead, they decided, well, we just need more wars so we can sell more military equipment. And they lobby, bribe politicians, you know, campaign funding, all the rest of it. And they hire propagandists like this to drum up fear, drum up support for war, so that you know, they get to sell more stuff. They get to Raytheon gets to make more $400,000 missiles to shoot down Chinese weather balloons, like what happened the other week. You know, US dollars. That's like 600 of ours. And so that's what it is. It's this permanent war machine that profits from human misery, including the, you know, if you're in Australia right now and you're struggling to make ends meet, this is part of the reason why. Because you know, all these billions of dollars that we supposedly have to spend on junk military equipment from these guys to defend against a China threat that doesn't exist.
Well, and when that's called out, we can see the vicious side of this. Coming to your article now on in this week's Australian Alert Service, if you haven't yet got a free copy, go to the website and you can get one there. Details on screen. Richard, you wrote an article this week called "Albanese Government Tortures Australian Citizens to Please Washington." So on the theme of Julian Assange you heard about before, this relates to a case of Daniel Duggan. Tell me about, you know, from the top down, who is Daniel Duggan and why is this important to note?
Okay, so this is a guy who he's a former American citizen, naturalised Australian. He was a United States Marine Corps fighter pilot from the mid to late 80s till around 2002. He retired, moved to Australia, became an Australian citizen in 2012, renounced his US citizenship. So he's not a dual citizen. Not that that particularly matters for the case as we'll go through, but just to note it as a fact. So this guy was arrested in October in his hometown of Orange in New South Wales, up in the hills. Nice place for those who don't know it. But on a sealed indictment, on an extradition request from the United States, or a provisional request, they hadn't actually made the charges known. They just said, hey, can you arrest this guy so we can charge him with something? So of course they did. The federal police arrest him, throw him in the clink, goes to court the same day, which means, you know, it's all prearranged. Gets put in a maximum security prison as a high risk, you know, as a security risk to the jailers and the other inmates, which is completely ridiculous. The man's never...
Mind you, this guy has never had a criminal offence
has no criminal
or charging record offence at all.
Nothing ever.
Nothing ever, and he's put straight into maximum security the same day, or roughly
shortly thereafter. He goes to court and then gets his. As of the other day, the last report I saw, he was in Silverwater, but he's going to be transferred to the Supermax in Goulburn, the maximum security jail in Australia, where they put all of the irredeemable, you know, unrepentant mass murderers, terrorists, and all of that sort of thing.
And pedophiles.
Pedophiles, serial killers, you know, they're throwing him in with those guys when he hasn't even been convicted of anything. So when they unsealed the indictment...
Which is like what has happened to Julian Assange, who's still sitting in Belmarsh prison in the UK.
Yeah.
Their Supermax prison,
exactly
under
the same
squalid conditions with health problems and the works.
Yeah.
There's an element in your article where you talk about how this is deliberate to break down the psychology
Yeah.
at a time when he is supposed to be given presumed innocent until proven guilty, afforded the ability to present a defence or to consult with his lawyers.
So he's being held under conditions where he says it's almost impossible for him to arrange, to have the appropriate time and confidential communications with his lawyers to plan his defence, which everyone's supposed to be entitled to. Doesn't get to see his family. They're an 8-hour return trip. Orange is 4 hours up in the hills from Sydney on a good day, and denied proper treatment for a prostate condition. It's a benign condition, but still a very uncomfortable sort of a thing to have to deal with. The guy's in his 50s,
So this. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say this started out as a sealed indictment, but then details of the accusations have come forth. He is alleged, just after he finished as a US Marine pilot, he goes in as a private practice, private business, a flight instructor. He does a time. He does from 2017 to 2020. He works in China as an aviation consultant. That winds up. He ends up being accused of training Chinese military pilots out of a South African flight school. And the story first emerges late last year, I understand, through the British press.
Yeah, well, they, the British, the week he was arrested, the British started this whole flap about retired Western pilots training Chinese, training the enemy when they're clearly not the enemy. We're not at war with China or anything. So they passed a new law. They said, well, look, none of these guys, they had a list of 30 of their pilots. They passed a new law that said this will be illegal from now on to do this without permission, so you'd better cut it out. In Australia, and this is very important, in Australia that is not, as of now, let alone previously, it's not illegal at all. And when the indictment was unsealed, this turns out to be charges not related to Mr. Duggan's time in China, but, as you said, to this flight school in South Africa in 2011, 2012, training pilots from all over the place. It's a test flying academy, so a specialised training institute for
important
test
to note,
pilots.
he was a permanent resident in Australia from 2002. And he got Australian citizenship in 2012.
In 2012, yeah. So around the end of this period when he's working in South Africa.
And an important point there, you said, under no current laws in Australia, has he committed a crime in South Africa training Chinese pilots, alleged Chinese military pilots? There's no crime being breached in Australia.
Yeah, so what the Americans say he's done is breached the conditions of what's called the International Trade in Arms Regulations, which is part of their Defence Exports Control Act. So basically means that they need permission to provide military equipment or services to foreign countries. Now, which supposedly training these Chinese pilots would breach because they taught them, among other things, how to land on the deck of an aircraft carrier. Now, Mr. Duggan and his lawyers say that he actually didn't breach that rule, but in either case, it doesn't matter for Australia's purposes because Australia's extradition treaty with the United States, which we signed back in the 80s, it's limited by a principle called dual criminality, where unless what the person is accused of is a crime in both countries, you don't get extradited. You can't be extradited. And so there's a related charge of money laundering that seems to be what they've hung this all on. But as best, no one talks about what money he's supposed to have laundered, and the only conclusion you can draw from my reading or anyone else who's commented on this, people more qualified than me, saying that this is just, it seems to be a technicality because they're declaring that what he did was illegal, and therefore, this conspiracy to launder money was just him and the other guys getting paid for the work they were doing, and or importing this old plane from America to conduct the training with which it's admitted that Duggan himself didn't do that. It was other people involved in the training school who purchased that plane. So there is no crime. Conspiracy to commit a non-crime is not a crime, right? It's a business plan. And so under that extradition treaty, this guy cannot be extradited for something that's not a crime under Australian law. In the meantime, what is Australian law, because it's international conventions that we've signed on to, is the International Conventions on Human Rights, including potentially the provisions on torture, because psychological torture is included in that, which this guy's being subjected to at the behest of the Americans by this spineless government that won't stand up for the rights of Australian citizens, even here, let alone abroad, like Julian Assange.
Well, that's an important point. So I did want to ask that question. What has the Australian government done in this case with Daniel Duggan since, you know, the first request for charges? You said before he was put in Supermax prison, a 2x4 cell.
Yeah. Well, his lawyers said, well, they can't figure out. They're trying to figure out where this classification came from, whose advice this was given on, because it wasn't the Australian Federal Police. They have communications from the Attorney General's office, who you know, Mark Dreyfus, who accepted this extradition or this request for an extradition proceedings. They said, well, where did it come from? So the only conclusion that they can draw, because it's being kept secret under these national security provisions, well, that implies that this is coming from somewhere else, one of the Five Eyes partners, probably America. So they filed a complaint with the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security. They filed complaints about his treatment in prison with the UN Human Rights Committee. Now, unfortunately, the IGIS is under-resourced to hell. They're about 30 people short of what they need in their office to operate effectively. This is a group that's supposed to have oversight of the intelligence agencies.
Of overreach by agencies.
Yeah.
Chronically understaffed.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's not an accident. But the Human Rights Committee, well, they can make findings and make requests, but they can just be ignored. Like Australia's been ignoring them for 20 years nearly on our horrific treatment of refugees. So, you know, if the government doesn't grow a backbone, this guy's just going to be left to suffer, just like other Australian citizens who have been arrested. You know, Mamdouh Habib, the Egyptian-Australian guy who was arrested in Pakistan, taken to Egypt by the CIA and tortured with ASIO's knowledge and complicity for a year, then locked up in Guantanamo.
And then released
without charge. David Hicks, who the Australian who was arrested in Kashmir, I think it was, or he trained in Kashmir and he went to Afghanistan, whatever it was. But he was arrested, you know, called a terrorist for trying to help the people that a few years before we were being told were the good guys, right? The Kashmiri groups that were allied with Al-Qaeda. And then ended up taking a plea bargain after he'd been locked in Guantanamo for years, that even the US Supreme Court said was garbage. The whole proceedings was garbage. And so, you know, there's a track record of Australian governments from both sides of the aisle just caving to the Americans on this stuff, and it's not acceptable.
Well, it's clear. I mean, it's a form of torture, and what's horrific about it is it's happening on our own soil, at the behest of someone in secret requesting this through the Five Eyes alliance. And the government has admitted, you know, messages to Attorney General Dreyfus' office and the government said we don't consider him to be a security risk. I mean, with no criminal record prior, except what the unifying force is this point about the hysteria around China and make an example of these people. It's exactly as Assange is suffering in the UK at the moment. So this has to be called out. We'll keep people in the loop on this, but whenever you've got a spare minute, when you're not doing calls advocating for a postal bank or mobilising or writing submissions and all the things we ask you to do, whenever you have a spare second, call the government, demand that they deliver on releasing Assange and having him return to Australia, make the representation of the United States, and also condemn this type of treatment of an Australian citizen. If we believe in justice, which is innocent until proven guilty, we wouldn't be torturing people like this.
Yeah, I mean, even if he was guilty of everything they've charged him with, it still doesn't warrant any of this. It's just disgusting.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So moving on to our second subject, and again, exemplary of the problem in Australia's economy is a certain form of colonisation. We've seen it with the Five Eyes and the military moving in, infesting our media, creating hysteria about China, and then you have the interoperable and interchangeable forces of Australia's military with the US military, B-52s in Darwin. This sense that anything the Americans want to drag us into their geopolitical games, we have a government that accepts it. How is that not other than colonisation, which we've been used to reading about in the history books? White Europeans colonised Australia, took over the place. Various empires colonised South America, and we always learn about this as being previous centuries, but it's happening in our backyard right now. Yep. There's another element to that colonisation, which of course is critical. We always talk about here is the question of banking. So, second subject today is yes, the government should do banking. And that obviously alludes to the fact that years ago, Joe Hockey and others keep repeating this mantra. We had it in Parliament the other day when Robbie and I were there, from David Littleproud, basically saying, no, we can't go back to a system where governments are involved in banking. Yep.
Yeah, that was Joe Hockey, 2014. If there's one thing we've learned, Mr. Speaker, is that governments should not be involved in banking.
And ironically, so soon after the global financial crisis brought about by the end of certain regulations and by the private banks completely destroying the world economy. Well, what's been happening in the media the last few weeks, especially since we got up our inquiry into the regional bank branch closures, Richard, is more calls for this discussion around a public postal bank alternative or a government bank alternative. I want to play just a short, just refer back to, it's on the Twitter feed and on 3AW's website. But last night at prime time 5 p.m. radio, Tom Elliott on 3AW radio interviewed our research director Robert Barwick on the matter of a post office bank, and highlighted in that coverage that the Citizens Party is been integral to pushing this idea. But then he highlighted, Tom Elliott highlighted that others, especially former politicians and former bankers, prominent bankers such as John Dawson and former Liberal leader John Elliott, have floated this idea.
Robbie, John Elliott, who was Tom Elliott's father.
Yes. I think president of the Liberal Party for a time, and quite a prominent figure. And then Robbie piped in to say, look, there's also organisations like the Chief Union that represents the postal workers, the Communications, Electrical, Plumbing Union, so which have put out reports like the per capita report in 2014, advocating for a postal bank. So we have examples across the spectrum where this is getting more airtime, especially after the sale hearings that happened last week, which we reported on. I wanted to just also highlight something very powerful. We had another rate rise this week, another 0.25% rate rise by the Reserve Bank. So this cascade of pain for borrowers and mortgage holders and debt holders is getting worse. And what is their claim? That this is going to reduce inflation.
Yeah, by squashing demand. And, only less than half of it's come through the pipe yet, in terms of mortgage payment increases, the cost of living, of course, gone up, and even Moody's Investors Services, one of the big ratings agencies, has just put out a report on Australia saying that, as Martin North, who we work with, Digital Finance Analytics, pointed out a couple of months ago, even though house prices are falling, they're still becoming less affordable because people are spending more on essential items and can't qualify for as large mortgages as they used to because the interest rates have gone up. So people are priced out of housing worse than they've ever been, even though the prices are coming down. And the Reserve Bank has just got this one blunt instrument that they keep, this one hammer that they keep bashing everybody with, and it's not working. And they admit it's not working three quarters of the case. So.
Well, that's right. And someone who's taken aim at that in a big way, both the Greens Party this week, Senator Nick McKim, calling for a halt to these rises in light of the fact it isn't working and it won't work. And then, surprisingly, Senator Gerard Rennick from the Liberal National Party in Queensland, it's a rare occasion when you see him agreeing with something the Greens say, but he got up in Parliament to say this, and he talked about the need for a completely different approach to addressing the inflationary problems, and it's a question of supply, the question of productivity, and he called it the Sovereign Seven, but how much it parallels our campaign for a national bank, a public bank, is great to see. So I want to play this 2-minute clip with what Senator Gerard Rennick had to say on the need for a national public bank.
They only deal with, and I've asked the RBA this myself, they only deal with the demand side, right? What we've got here in Australia at the moment is that we've had supply shocks. So people often think that inflation is caused only by too much demand. That's not the case. And, you know, if too much demand is trying to make ends meet, well, I'm sorry, but that's not too much demand. That's a lack of productivity in our own economy because we don't build enough nation-building infrastructure to actually provide essential services at affordable rates. And what we really need to do in this country is stop being afraid of building infrastructure, in particular what I call the Sovereign Seven, which are dams, rail, road, power stations, telecommunications, and airports and ports. And those are the things that if we supply more of those things through quantitative easing, and no, everyone, you know, I was brainwashed. It took me 30 years to unbrainwash myself because I had this rubbish forced down my throat at university. There is nothing wrong. We see companies do it all the time. They issue shares, they issue equity, they issue new equity to build a new mine. As a country, we can issue new equity to build infrastructure. It's debit asset, credit equity. Or if you want to call it, you can create an infrastructure banks here at the federal government level, and they can lend to the state governments, and then the state governments pay interest back to the National Infrastructure Bank, and then the National Infrastructure Bank can pay dividends back through to the federal government, which will basically be a form of raising revenue, adding more infrastructure and more supply to the economy, which will push down the prices of essential services. And that's not just good for the cost of living, that will make it more competitive for our businesses to compete with other businesses in the world.
So, Richard, what do you think? Can we trust the Reserve Bank of Australia to handle this problem of the economy at the moment?
Well, not as it's currently run. I mean, and that's, as we've reported, as Elisa Bowick has reported in the alert service over the last several weeks, this whole thing about austerity, because that's what this is, that's what these interest rate rises are designed to do by their own admission, to crush demand, you know, make people pay more for things or spend less by not buying things, including essentials. It's not the only tool available to them, but it's the only one that they've convinced themselves they're allowed to use. And that goes for the government as well as the Reserve Bank. And this all comes down from the, even World War I era, but through the interwar period, this thing called the Bank for International Settlements that we've talked about on this show before, the central bank of central banks, who, it's actually a script written by the banks, by the City of London and the Bank of England. But they set up this thing as this supposedly impartial arbiter of war reparations and debt settlements and things like that, which was supposed to get shut down after the Second World War because it was helping the Nazis. Half of its original board were Nazis. But here it is still today, and that's largely what's, as I say, writing the script for these austerity policies around the world, these neoliberal, as they call it, ideas that, that governments have to be hands-off, and that the private sector has to do everything, and the government should just smooth the way.
Well, there's a collective amnesia amongst policymakers and politicians today. They talk about government having no role in banking, as though this has been a some kind of sacrament or
like it was handed to Moses on a tablet.
Yeah, and what's interesting is if we were to move ourselves into the perspective of previous generations. I mean, Gerard Rennick today wouldn't be far removed from any of the policies that were advocated by previous generations, like Ben Chifley, like John Curtin, or in the US example, Abraham Lincoln or Alexander Hamilton.
Or Franklin Roosevelt.
Yeah, and Elisa, in her series of reports in the Australian Alert Service, has shown that this was adopted by Germany and other protectionist nations in previous centuries to build up a sovereign capability.
Yeah, every country, including Australia, that's ever gone ahead has done it that way, not the way that we're doing things now. And, as far as governments not being involved in banking, well, for most of our history as the Federation, the Commonwealth of Australia, we had a public bank from 1912 up until they privatised it in the 90s. Over 80 years worth of governments being involved in banking, and it worked. I mean, think about how much better things, there were still massive problems,
And that's where Paul Keating really got it wrong.
Yeah, that was as we were saying earlier. There's a lot. We have a lot of issues with Mr. Keating. He's pretty decent on foreign policy, terrible on economic policy. But that was what they did. Labor and Liberal, they privatised the Commonwealth Bank, and since then it's been open slather by private banks with no government backstop there for people to go to if they, that just want somewhere just safe to keep their money that's guaranteed by the government. They don't want to get into investments and this and that. And it forced the private banks to keep their noses clean. Otherwise they just lose all their business. We had that for 80-something years. And now they say, oh no, it's like we said, like it was carved in stone that governments cannot be involved in banking.
No, it's definitely been a brainwashing process. And in Gerard Rennick's speech, he said, I had to undo that damage that was done to me in university. So if he can do it, you can too, and your neighbours can as well. It brings us to an end of the program today. For those watching on this question of a public bank, please remember we've got until the end of this month to put in a submission to the Senate Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport Committee. This is on the question of regional bank closures. The details for making a submission are on our website and on screen. We need to advocate for a public government bank option as an answer to all of these private banks shutting down access to services and cash. Reverse the colonisation, the neoliberal and warmongering colonisation of the country. Richard, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Glenn.
Join us next week for the Citizens Report. Thank you.
Authorised by Robert Bowick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.